to host Mr. Jeffrey Amestoy, former Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court and former Attorney General of the state of Vermont, whose distinguished career in public service includes landmark contributions to Vermont's legal and civic history. Beyond the bench, Justice Amestoy is also an accomplished historian and author, with the gift of bringing the past vividly to life through meticulous research and storytelling. Please join me in welcoming Justice Amestoy as he shares his insights from his latest work and remarkable history behind it.
Thank you for a warmer introduction than I deserved. I have to say, I'm just so impressed with this, when you drive up, you have to admit, I think it's going to be a tremendous historical society, but the collection of stuff here is just fantastic. So it's just, and something about the challenges of trying to keep together collections and all the rest. And of course, for those of us who dabble in trying to write history, historical societies are really important, and particularly in trying to capture Vermont history. So I want to thank you for first inviting me, of course. Secondly, Theo, you had been a help in writing the book. For those of you who pick up a copy of the book, there's a picture in there of Frank Cohn. There are actually two pictures of Frank Cohn, but the one that's most significant to me anyway is in the book is a picture of Frank Cohn in front of his automobile. Somebody will have to identify it. It's probably a Cadillac. I couldn't identify it. In 1920, and it's in this collection. It's in the Springfield collection. And so when I was looking for it, Theo found Theo was my contact and gave me permission, and it's in the book. So I thank you for that. I've often been asked what got me interested in state versus, in, of course, this case of State versus Winters, and when I reply that I became interested during my first court appearance in 1973, those who are asking the question are usually about the age of our television. So they are polite enough, as I'm sure there would be, to hide their disbelief. But so, although it may seem like an impossibly long time ago for some people, there may be some here today who think it's only yesterday. At least it seems only yesterday to me. In any event, it was 50 years ago that I was a young lawyer in the lawyer's room at Windsor Superior Court in Woodstock, nervously awaiting my first appearance in court. And to mask my anxiety, I said to one of the senior lawyers, they were all senior to me, of course, I said, what's the photograph on the wall? And he replied, he said, well, that's a photograph of the participants in the most famous murder trial ever to occur in this courthouse. So that got me interested, of course, but it was really 2 years later when, as an assistant attorney general, I was researching a case on it, and as part of that research, I found State versus Winters, the Vermont Supreme Court opinion, 1929 opinion, and Vermont Supreme Court opinions always listed the opening of the opinion, the lawyers who appeared in the case. So I wasn't thinking anything particular about that, other than I was about to read the case, and I read, appearing for the defendant, John Winters, Clarence Darrow of Chicago, Illinois. Wow. Well, again, for those of us who go back a little ways, I mean, that was just unbelievable to read that. Clarence Darrow, the most famous lawyer in America in the 1920s, what could possibly explain him being in Vermont to argue a death penalty case before the Vermont Supreme Court? So that got me interested. But as Theo pointed out, there's a little bit of a detour there between the idea and the book. I don't claim that being Attorney General or Chief Justice makes it a good book, but it did give me some perspective on from the prosecutor's perspective, of course, and then from the perspective of the Chief Justice too. And again, it's just difficult to convey the extraordinary celebrity that Darrow was in the 1920s. He was more than, he was the most famous lawyer, but he was a celebrity as well known as, well, nobody was as well known as Charles Lindbergh perhaps, but he was on that level. I mean, it was a chaplain, and Darrow, I mean, he was really, really extraordinary. And his, part of his fame, sometimes when I talk to people, they said, well, you know, what was it? I said, to me, it was the equivalent of Babe Ruth leaving the 1927 Yankees to come to Springfield, Vermont to pinch hit for semi-pro team. That's how big the story would have been. It was just, again, something that eventually propelled me to write this book. Darrow was an outspoken opponent of capital punishment, and depending on your point of view, he was either famous or infamous for saving clients from the death penalty. When I proposed as a subtitle to Winter's Time, A Secret Pledge, A Severed Head, and the murder that brought Clarence Darrow to Vermont, a young friend of mine at the Vermont Historical Society asked some of his young friends if they'd ever heard of Clarence Darrow. The answer was no. And I said, but he was America's most famous lawyer. And they said, okay, well, why don't you use that in the title then? Nobody objected to Severed Head, however. And there's no question that's prompted interest in the book. I was unfamiliar with the world of true crime podcasts. Apparently it's a big one. I did a podcast with one called, someplace, Chicago, I think, one called Most Notorious. They asked a lot more about the severed head than they did about Vermont. But I wouldn't have written the book, and the Vermont Historical Society wouldn't have published it if the case didn't shed some insight into the roaring 20s in rural Vermont. And it's a short book, it's only about 100 pages long, but I've tried to, in the context of the case, talk about not only justice, of course, but celebrity, class, gender, the society of Vermont in the 1920s. And I think the case, if I've done what I hope I've done, the case gives you a vehicle into that, some perspective of Vermont in the 1920s. My research really began in earnest about 3 years ago. And not only do the local historical societies, not only were the local historic societies like Springfield and Windsor and others helpful, at the Vermont State Archives, of course, they have a tremendous collection, but I was really, really astonished to learn that, and find that they had a 3-volume, 700-page transcript of the murder trial of State versus Winters.
Wow.
I think it had been moved from, we were just talking about some of the material here that had been moved, and in Windsor, which that would have been out of Woodstock, but there was some concern maybe 15 or 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, about flooding and all the rest. And so a number of the superior courts had their records shipped to Montpelier and then stored in the archives. And that's where I found the 3-volume transcript. I had not intended when I thought about the book, planned the format of the book, I hadn't planned to talk very much about the trial. My interest was in Darrow's appeal to the Supreme Court. Clarence Darrow had no involvement in the trial. He didn't come until after the trial. And that was what I thought I was going to mostly write about. It was only in reading the trial transcript when I was stunned to learn what the special prosecutor had introduced into evidence that I said, maybe there's a first part to this book. And that's what I want to share with you today. We'll talk a little bit about the first part of the book, which is the trial piece. An early chapter of Winter's Time is entitled Cecilia's Day, and it was my attempt, my best attempt to recreate Cecilia Gulliver's last day of her life, which was November 6th, 1926. But by Cecilia's Day, I also meant day in the sense of her time, and I wanted to try to capture a little more about it. But the material on it was fairly sparse, and again, as you know, as students of history, if you're trying to recreate or describe something without much material, you have to take some leaps of faith. But I don't think I missed when I concluded she was an extraordinary woman, extraordinary for any time, I think, but especially extraordinary for her time and her profession. She was, at the time, she was the treasurer of the Cone Automatic Machine Company in Windsor, Vermont, which of course a huge deal at the time. She was a machine tool expert in her own way, highly unusual. And she held in 1926 probably the most senior executive position of any woman in Vermont. And she held it in a male-dominated industry, in a male-dominated world. This historical society, including some of your exhibits, is well aware of the significance of Precision Valley, and of course, as is Windsor. Precision Valley has been compared to, and I think the comparison is apt, to Silicon Valley in terms of its significance to advancing American prosperity. I mean, really, when you go back and look at the history, the machine tool industry had as much impact on advancing American prosperity as the Silicon Valley did with computers. And the comparison is apt in another way. It was just as unusual to be a leader, a woman leader of Silicon Valley in the early days of Silicon Valley, as it was to be a woman leader of Precision Valley in the 1920s. So she was something special. And for many Windsor and Vermont men and women, she was the modern woman. She owned her own home. She drove her own car. She dressed in the styles of the Roaring Twenties that complemented her slender figure. She, in 1926, she was a successful 43-year-old single professional woman. On the evening of November 6, 1926, she took special care with her appearance. She was meeting her boss, Frank Cohn, that evening. The next morning, she was dead. Her body was not discovered until November 8th, Monday. On Sunday, the day before, Windsor residents awoke to the news of a different crime. On early in the morning of November 7th, Sunday morning, 2 a.m., an intruder had broken into the house of Margaret Everts, an invalid who was being looked after by a nurse and others in the house. The nurse fought off the intruder, but was badly beaten in doing so. When on Monday, November 8th, Cecilia was not at work, Frank Cohn went to her house. He found her dead body on the sleeping porch. Cohn went back into Windsor, got a doctor and the police come to the house. At the house, the doctor lifted the sheet covering the body. Asked at trial if he replaced the sheet. The doctor said, "No, I dropped the thing. I was so horrified." Vermont Tribune headline: Murderous attack on two women stir Windsor to a high pitch. It also characterized Cecilia Gulliver's murder as the most brutal in the history of Vermont. plus the break-in at the Everett's house magnified both the Vermont and national interest in the case. The Everetts were a very well-known Windsor family, of course, but well-known in American history too. William Maxwell Everett's, the sort of the founder of the family, and married a Windsor woman, and so that was the Windsor connection. He was famous for saving Andrew Johnson from impeachment, and his son was also a great lawyer. So the Everett's family was very well known. In fact, he had this break-in and then this murder just made this a story that really had national news. And of course, it was a time when the advent of, in the 1920s, really the first media advent of the radio, newspaper empires like the Hearst, in newspaper competitions. And the two things that sold newspapers were celebrity and crime. So, media hasn't changed all that much, right? Still how you get your hits. But it's always in a significant case, a notorious case. The public wanted action, and they wanted information. Were there any suspects? Was there a murder weapon? What was the motive? The sheriff from Windham County, Wallace Fairbanks, he didn't know, but he claimed he did. The Windsor police had no clues. The Vermont State Police wasn't established for another 20 years. So, but Vermont's Attorney General knew what every Attorney General knows, including this one. In a notorious case that's going to go to trial, you want the best trial lawyer, and that's seldom the Attorney General. J. Ward Carver had just been elected to his first full term as Vermont's Attorney General 1 week before the murder. He went immediately to Governor Billings and asked for the appointment of a special prosecutor. They agreed to appoint Raymond Traynor of White River Junction, who was considered the best trial lawyer in Vermont at the time. It was an inspired choice, but on appeal, Clarence Darrow was to argue that the special prosecutor was so interested in obtaining conviction that it was not a fair trial. But first, the prosecution needed a suspect. Windsor County Sheriff Wallace Fairbanks knew where they could find one. This is a quote from the Vermont Tribune. You can imagine how happy prosecutors were when they read this. Windsor has the prison. Each day sees the release of prisoners. Some of these men are of the lowest type. Those in charge of the investigation thought here was the solution to the mystery of the crime. It's not clear why John Winters was initially targeted, but he had served time for sexual assault. He had done some work for the Everett's house, and he was an employee of the Cone Automatic Company. Winters had been released from prison in 1919. In the 7 years since, had been employed, had never been in trouble, and was raising a family. He was taken to the Windsor State Prison, to death cell, and he was held there for 5 days. He was not arrested. He was not entitled to a lawyer, nor to remain silent. The Miranda warnings that you may all be familiar with somebody in custody has to be advised that they have a right to a lawyer and a right to remain silent. That case was 40 years off. That didn't happen until 1966. So there was no such thing in the 1920s. And in fact, just 3 years before, the Vermont Supreme Court had upheld a confession obtained from a defendant who was chained in solitary confinement to the floor until he confessed. That was not considered a problem in the 1920s. Sheriff Fairbanks, always interested in helping again, told reporters that Winters would soon confess, quote, because he will not be able to stand up under the cruel grilling of State Detective Brown. Brown was the Attorney General's investigator, and he did try a number of good cop, bad cop techniques. He brought Winters into the house of Margaret Everett, the invalid, He brought the nurse there. He had sort of recreate. He had the nurse stand in back of Winters, essentially the way that Prime was described that night. And then Brown told Winters that the nurse had identified him as the person who had broken into the Everett's house. Winters said, well, then take me out and hang me. I mean, denied it vehemently. Would not admit anything at that point. So on the fifth day of being held in the death cell, the Attorney General's detective asked the special prosecutor to come and see if they could, in that last day, get some kind of a statement out of Winters. They did get a statement, but it was far from a confession. The prison warden described Winters as a tough nut. So he was either that or he wasn't the murderer. The state either had to arrest him, either had to release him or arrest him. They chose the latter. On November 13th, 1926. John Winters was charged with breaking and entering into the Everett's house, the assault on the nurse, and the murder of Cecilia Goldman. Sheriff Fairbanks described the case, quote, as iron-bound from the beginning. Special Prosecutor Traynor knew better, and so did Springfield attorney Herbert Tupper, who was assigned by the court to represent Winters. Tupper was not Clarence Darrow, but he was a good lawyer, and in fact, he was good enough to earn Clarence Darrow's friendship and respect when they argued a case before the Vermont Supreme Court. Most readers all readers probably, if you relied on the newspaper accounts, most readers thought Winters would confess to murder. Herbert Tupper had a different approach. He said, if my client has been arrested for murder, on what evidence has the arrest been made? It was a good question. Special Prosecutor Traynor could not answer it. Defense lawyer Tupper demanded that the prosecution present its evidence at a preliminary hearing, which they certainly had a right to make that request. So many Windsor residents and reporters clamored to get into the hearing that was moved to the Windsor Armory. There were actually three preliminary hearings, each with many, many spectators, hundreds really. At each one, Special Prosecutor Traynor found a reason not to present evidence. At the first, he said the nurse was sick. At the second, he said Detective Brown was sick. And at the third, he said he was sick. He was playing a deep game. He was stalling so he could convene a grand jury. Grand juries are seldom used in Vermont. In the 12 years I was Attorney General, we never used a grand jury to indict a defendant. Usually the standard practice in Vermont is through affidavits called information. You present that to a judge who then makes the ruling as to whether or not there's sufficient evidence to arrest a defendant. Grand juries have some advantages for prosecutors. They're secret. Defense lawyers are not allowed. It's said among lawyers, this is a cliche among lawyers, but that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. So when you read in current news about the difficulty of obtaining a grand jury indictment, it is really, really unusual. Prosecutor Traynor got his grand jury in December of 1926. It charged John Winters with the first-degree murder of Cecilia Goldman, a crime punishable by death. The trial began in January 1927. The state's case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. It was critical for the prosecution to persuade the judge to allow evidence of the Everett's assault into the trial because only the nurse could identify Winters. The judge ruled that evidence could come in. That's probably a close question today. I doubt that the Supreme Court, the court would allow that, which they did in any event. But even with that evidence, the special prosecutor did not believe he could convict Winters without more. The more was Exhibit 35. Exhibit 35 was the severed head of Cecilia Golden. It had been removed by the medical examiner because the special prosecutor decided he needed a demonstration to show the jury what weapons were used to murder Cecilia Golden. Gentlemen of the jury, prosecutor said in his opening statement, women were not allowed on the Vermont jury until 1943. The state will show you the weapons that could have made these wounds. Police had taken from Winters' home 1 week after the murder a chisel, and the prosecutor intended to show the jury how the wounds were made with a demonstration with the head. A demonstration unprecedented in the history of Vermont criminal trial, and as far as I could determine, we spent some time looking at this, it never occurred anywhere else in the United States. Prosecutor began by calling the assistant medical examiner, Dr. Fred Kent, to the stand, and here I'm quoting directly from the trial transcript. Question: Dr. Kent, at the time you performed the autopsy on Miss Sullivan, did you take some part of her body away with you? Answer: yes, sir. Question: what did you take? Answer: I took the head. And have you Miss Golden's head? I have. Have you hear it in court? Yes. I was shocked, even as a prosecutor, reading a cold transcript nearly 100 years later. You can imagine what it was like in that courtroom. And to a lawyer, there was something almost as shocking on the next page of the transcript. When the judge asked the defense if there's any objection to the introduction of the head into evidence, the defense lawyers respond, no objection. The failure to object is virtually inexplicable. It certainly would have led to a reversal of the conviction. But by failing to object, that meant the issue was not preserved on appeal. So that was not an issue you could raise. Although the trial would last several more days, the introduction of the head and special prosecutor Trainer's devastating cross-examination of Winters when Winters took the stand in his own defense really meant the presumption of innocence was gone. There was very little chance the jury was going to pay much attention to a reasonable doubt instruction. On February 18th, 1927, 1 month after the trial had begun, the case went to the jury. 2 hours after 2 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder, punishable by death. Judge Frank Thompson had one question for Springfield lawyer Herbert Tupper. Do you expect to take this case to the Supreme Court? Juror's reply was brief and to the point. Yes, Your Honor. In May 1927, 3 months after John Winters was convicted of murder and faced the death penalty, Clarence Darrow was speaking at Dartmouth College. The 70-year-old Darrow had just announced his retirement as a practicing lawyer. It was big news. The New York Times had a big story about it. It said that Darrow had planned to lecture about capital punishment, his opposition to capital punishment, and to write. Dartmouth seemed a good place to start to start his lecture tour because Darrow's son Paul was a 1904 Dartmouth graduate. When Darrow finished his lecture, entitled Why I Am Opposed to Capital Punishment, a student said, "A woman has a letter for you." Clarence Darrow, in writing to his son Paul the next day, wrote, "I told the student he was crazy and no such thing could have happened." In 1904, Paul's horse, spooked by a steam whistle, had fatally trampled a 5-year-old boy. Paul never told any member of his family about that. Paul Darrow, devastated by the accident, had given the boy's mother a letter with a pledge. If she or any member of her family ever needed legal help, Paul promised that his father would give it. Now, 23 years after the accident, the pledge was being redeemed. "I need your help," said Mrs. Arthur Cooley to America's most famous lawyer. "My nephew, John Winters, is on death row in Vermont." And so ends part 1.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Oh my goodness. Wow. That's right.
Happy to take any questions and hope that summary of part 1 might get you to look at part 2 of the book.
I'm interested. I've read your book. It's absolutely fascinating. A true page turner. It's being passed around in my community, Plainfield, New Hampshire, which is a suburb of Windsor. Anyway, I'd be fascinated if you could tell us a bit about the amount of time that you did this research. It was obviously vast. I mean, how long was this book a work in progress?
Well, you know, I'm claiming over 50 years, but not quite. Yes, I mean, I really, as I said, during COVID, I really decided that I could use some time doing that. But I would say it took me 3 years, 3.5 years, something like that. I had hoped, this is all vanity on my part, of course, which my wife Susan here could tell you this, something about that. I assumed that, you know, once I put Severed Head in the title, I could shop this as a proposal and sell it to an agent to pick it up, but I couldn't. And I think part of the reason was, as Theo mentioned, I'd written a book that Harvard University Press had published. I didn't think it was an academic book, but I think part of the baggage I then had was, well, no, we don't think you can write a book that's interesting. So anyway, it's a long answer to a short question, but what that meant was when I went to the Vermont Historical Society, they were interested as long as we could broaden it out so I could touch on some of the issues that I talked about in the justice class, gender discrimination. They said, and of course we want endnotes, footnotes. I didn't have that. I didn't have that in mind, but it actually was the right request. It was going to be a book for the Historical Society, and that really got me into some areas I wouldn't have elsewhere. But that can be really extensive. And again, as I talked about once I spent a lot of time with the transcript. Of course, and just as one thing I found interesting was, so in those days, you know, they had a court stenographer, right, and then after the conviction, but before the appeal, the defense lawyers have to make a request. They made a request for the transcript because they've got to go through the transcript, figure out what issues they preserved for appeal. I mean, of course, they were mortified they hadn't appealed it. They hadn't preserved the one that could have led to the reversal of the severed head. But in reading the 3 volumes, 700 pages. I spent a lot of time on that. There wasn't not a single mistyped word in that whole transcript. None, you know.
Wow.
And so that was a court stenographer who, you know, when they made that, she's from Rutland. I'm originally from Rutland. Her name was Shambo, and I went to school with Shambo. I said, hey, that's part of the Shambo family. But she, you know, that was, so it was just really, really remarkable. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and again, in terms of, you know, I'm sure that everybody in this room knows more about Precision Valley and its history than I do. But I went, and I began my practice I only had 1 year of private practice before I worked for the Attorney General's office, but it was in Windsor. But I hadn't realized until I got back into this book about how much history there was there. And of course, the American Precision Museum was a great help. I spent some time there, and then across the river, the Windsor relationship there was really something. In Windsor, in the 1920s and before, and I mean Evarts, William Maxwell Evarts had been Secretary of State and Senator from New York. He had an estate in Windsor, and people from across the river would come to visit him. Five presidents had come to visit him in the space of 10 years or 12 years. So I mean, it really was quite extraordinary. And Springfield, Precision Valley was a huge deal. So all that was new. It broadened my perspective, and like anything else, then you have to worry about getting, well, wait, can I write about this part? No, you got to keep it. The challenge always is, as you all know, in any book is, if you can't get the reader to turn the page, it doesn't matter how much research you've done, how good, so that's what I try to do. So I appreciate your review.
In that research, did you get any feeling about how the community in Cone Blanchard recovered from not having their wonderful secretary?
Yeah, I did. I think we talked about. I said I had done a talk in Windsor where sort of owed them the first place because I spent so much time there. And when I did, it was really interesting. As it always is in these things I find, is folks come up to you afterwards and talk a little bit about what their connection was. And so a gentleman came up and so there were actually two stories, both which I think relate to your question. First was so he had some distant relative that obviously it was important to him, and he remembers it. Well, my great grandmother, but she was mentored by. She was a young business student, and she was mentored by Cecilia Goldman. She thought the world of her. The other one was just really quite striking story. He said my aunt was a young girl and who knew Cecilia Goldman, and she was sounded like she might have been 13 or 14 at the time of the murder, 15. And he said my aunt died about 10 years ago, and she had Alzheimer's, and in the last, she's not very coherent there in the last year of her life, but the one phrase she kept repeating was, lock the door, lock the door, lock the door. And he said, I had never made a connection at all. And he just said, I wondered if that's the connection. And so that's, and I learned, this is not I have a Cone Blanchard story though, which is much later on. In Cone, you'll in the book, there's Cone was you have to read the book to get a feel for what Cone was at one point looked at as a person of interest, a suspect. At another point, not. But Cone was he was a really a mechanical genius, as so many people that came out of the hill farms in that time were. The reason why Vermont was a leader in American precision industry, and so he had kept the plant running even in the 30s. And he died of a heart attack in 1936, and of course, Cone continued. So in 1986, something like that, I was very young commissioner of labor and industry for Governor Snelling. And Cone Blanchard, at that point in time, probably some people here will be familiar. all sorts of labor problems that were endemic to the industry, of course. And I think in that particular period, Cone Blanchard, they'd been out, like 8 months, 9 months, something like that, in a serious long-term strike. And I'd probably been commissioner for kind of 2 weeks or something. And Snelling said, Governor Snelling said to me, I want you to go to Windsor and see if you can get some agreement. So, sure, sounds like something I could do. So down I went, and I took the approach that it seemed reasonable to me. That labor here, management here, and I said, so what are your positions? And each got up, left the room. And a few minutes later, they came back in and they said, Governor Snelling's on the phone for you. I said, oh, okay. And they said, Governor Snelling said, well, you got an agreement. Of course, I wasn't surprised. And he said, the agreement is they think you don't know what you're doing, so why don't you come back in? It's a true story.
Oh, that's great. Know what you're doing.
Well,
Yeah, I'd like to know more about Darrell in the area. Did he stay during the trial and before the trial? Did he stay in the Windsor area, and where? And
yeah, he stayed. Well, he wasn't. So he didn't have a part in the trial, but when he came to Vermont to argue the appeal, he stayed at the Pavilion. And actually, for readers of the book, he had to come back a second time, and he did, which is really remarkable. But there is a connection to Springfield afterwards, because after, I hate to give things away, but at some point Darrell ended up back in Vermont for the third time, actually on his 72nd birthday, I think. And again, because of his relationship with Tupper, I'm not sure where he stayed, but I remember reading Tupper arranged for him to come to somebody's house. Do you have like the Cosmos Club or the Cosmopolitan Club or something?
Yes, I did.
Cosmopolitan Club?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as his guest. So, it was a bit, that's a huge deal, And it was some indication of how much Darrell thought of Tupper, I think. But that was in Springfield, yeah.
Okay.
And then as it turned out, again, read the book, it became unnecessary for him to stick around very much longer.
So how do we read the book?
Well, we actually have the book here for sale.
We never come empty.
Now, when was that third visit up? What time frame? What year?
That would have been 28. I mean, I just think I know I was not like, early 29.
Okay.
Yeah, it would have been, but it was after it was after the court had reached an opinion. So yeah, no, it would have been it would have been 1929. It was 1929. Yeah. And Darrell, I mean, again, back to the question about research, and I hadn't thought of. One has to take a step. At least you have to take a step back sometimes. We're so focused on the Darrell and the trial and everything. You're right, but Vermont was there's some. It was prohibition, one, right? And women that just got to vote, they didn't sit on a jury. The flood, the 1927 flood happened right, just before the argument. There were no records were destroyed. So just, and significantly for Darrell and his son, the crash, in 1929, just the crash had a big impact, and of course had a tremendous impact on Vermont, but on Darrell and his family as well. So. Yeah, thank you.